Okay, hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at an argument for skepticism about philosophy. That is, skepticism that we can ever be justified in believing philosophical theories. The argument is a kind of pessimistic induction, analogous to the pessimistic induction in philosophy of science. Different forms of this argument have been raised by various people, but a good statement of it comes from Brian Francis's article, Worrisome Skepticism About Philosophy. So, the basic problem is that for every philosophical argument or conclusion that I once defended, there were serious objections to it that I was unaware of at the time and to which I had no response. Sometimes these objections were later presented by other philosophers, sometimes I came up with them myself and subsequently changed my view. Sometimes it only takes a day to figure out these problems, sometimes it can take years. Sometimes objections can come from very surprising places. Consider how eliminative materialism in philosophy of mind, which denies that there are intentional states such as beliefs and desires, consider how that would force us to rethink much of epistemology. I mean, epistemologists often frame things in terms of beliefs. I mean, you think of knowledge, for instance, as justified true belief. So if eliminative materialism is true, then it looks like that whole program is overturned. And many epistemologists aren't experts with respect to the issues relevant to eliminativism. So, you get something from a completely different philosophical field. This is an objection from philosophy of mind, but it ends up significantly affecting epistemology. So objections, might come from the field in which a particular position is proposed, or they might come from a completely different field. They can come from surprising places. Anyway, the point is, the vast majority of philosophical positions that I endorsed in the past, I now recognise have serious flaws that at the time I was unaware of. Okay, so now consider those positions that I currently endorse. I should expect that if these positions were scrutinised further, they too would face serious objections that I haven't yet considered. And by serious objections, I mean objections that, by my own lights, I can't give a satisfying answer to. So, most of the theses that I currently accept probably face serious problems that just haven't yet been revealed. And this seems to undermine my justification for believing those positions. Surely, if there are serious objections to a position that I do not know how to answer, there's something epistemically defective about continuing to believe that position. I mean, at least other things being equal. So, as Francis puts it, induction on past experiences gives us excellent evidence that there is good evidence against the positions that we accept. Evidence in the form of serious objections that may be currently unconceived. And from this, it seems to follow that we should suspend judgment about almost every philosophical claim. Okay, so that's the general idea, that's the general argument. Francis gives a slightly more formal statement of the argument as follows. So we begin with what he calls the awareness condition. The awareness condition is, S is aware that for almost every substantive philosophical thesis that she defended at least several years ago, there were serious objections to the thesis that by her own lights she was unable to meet. And the crucial point is, what's crucial here is, I was unable to deal with the objections back then. Perhaps I have since come up with what I regard as plausible responses to the objections. Even so, at that time in the past, those objections were unmet. I had no adequate response to them. And in some cases, this will be because I hadn't even thought of them. I only have to consider cases where I've changed my mind about some substantive philosophical thesis. At the time that I believed it, either I underestimated the objections, or I overestimated my responses to those objections, or I just wasn't even aware of some important objections. What happened is, as I became aware of them, I changed my mind. And then, of course, there will be cases where there were positions I accepted that had serious objections, I later became aware of those objections. Maybe I was able to answer those objections, so I continue to believe the position. But even so, in the past, there were serious objections that I didn't have an answer to. And, that's epistemically problematic, right? Okay, so that's the awareness condition. And then B, if the awareness condition is true of me, then I have good evidence that for any philosophical thesis I believe today, there are serious objections to that thesis that by my own lights I am unable to meet. I would be unable to meet right now if I were aware of those objections. This is a basic inductive inference. In the past, the theses I accepted faced serious objections, so probably the current theses I accept face serious objections. Okay, and from this we have premise C. If I have good evidence that the philosophical theses I currently accept face serious objections that by my own lights I'm unable to meet, then in order to rationally retain my belief in those theses, I must have some epistemic item that overwhelms the contrary evidence. So this is to say, I need some epistemic item that makes my belief rational, despite the inductive evidence against it. What could this item be? Well, there are various possibilities here. Maybe this time I really do have adequate responses to all the serious objections. So maybe I have some reason to believe that, today things are different, and today I do have responses to all the serious objections. Or maybe God has told me that my positions are true and that all the objections to it are terrible, right? Or maybe I just have an enormous mountain of evidence in favour of some position, a mountain of evidence that's enough to outweigh the inductive evidence from, my past history. The problem, of course, is that none of this seems to be the case in philosophy. All we have in philosophy are arguments and objections, usually based on very controversial premises. When it comes to philosophical positions, we don't have God coming down from the sky telling us what's true. We don't have, massive mountains of evidence that just, overwhelm any potential opposition. So we have premise D, but I do not have such an epistemic item for most of my philosophical beliefs. So, you can just consider how philosophers actually proceed when defending their positions, right? I'm expected to anticipate potential objections. I'm expected to respond adequately to the objections that others raise. If I can't come up with a good response, then it looks like I have a defeater for my position. So the conclusion is, in general, in a large number of cases, it's going to be irrational for me to retain belief in philosophical positions. So that's the skeptical argument. That's the argument against philosophy. But if you happen to like philosophy and you want to give money to somebody who's making philosophical content, you can donate to my Patreon or donate on PayPal. I have bonus videos on Patreon, Patreon exclusive bonus videos, which I will be uploading about once a week. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy, so email if you're interested in that. And I have a Discord, which you can join. Okay, so Francis has given a skeptical argument that appeals to an induction over an individual's beliefs. So I, as an individual, look back over my beliefs that I held in the past and I notice that there's this pattern of serious objections to them. Well, there's a similar skeptical argument given by Moti Mizrahi, among others, but he's one of them. And this time it targets the development of philosophy as a whole. Mizrahi calls this the problem of unconceived objections. So the idea is that when we look at the history of philosophy, we find that at any given time there were serious objections to the best philosophical theories of that time that were unconceived at that time. Philosophers generally, it seems, fail to conceive of serious objections to their theories. So the history of philosophy is a history of, the best philosophical theories would later be shown to face serious objections that, at the time those theories were proposed, were just unconceived. So here's, just some examples. We have Plato's theory of forms, and then we have the third man argument, which raises a very serious problem to it. In the early 1900s, Bertrand Russell defended the description theory of proper names. Many decades later, in the 70s and 80s, very serious objections to this were raised by, for instance, Kripke and others, and that led to the development of wholly different theories of meaning. And then you have causal theories of meaning, right? Causal theories of reference. Those were developed due to the objections that were raised against the descriptivist theory. Those causal theories themselves later faced serious objections like the qua problem. The logical positivists defended the verification principle as a criterion of meaning. This later faced what many philosophers think are knockdown objections. I mean, for instance, from Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. You've got hedonism about well-being versus Nozick's experience machine. You've got functionalism about the mind versus Searle's Chinese room. The justified true belief analysis of knowledge versus Gettier cases. And then, of course, the various other Gettier-style counterexamples to all of the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis. You've got moral naturalism versus the moral twin earth objection. You've got the correspondence theory of truth versus Davidson's slingshot argument. Anti-realist theories of truth versus Fitcher's knowability paradox. I mean, obviously this list can be extended indefinitely. And an interesting thing to note, of course, is that pretty much all of the objections on this list themselves fell prey to serious objections. I mean, it's not as though the debates simply ended with these objections. So, like with, okay, functionalism versus the Chinese room. Chinese room, very, very influential objection to functionalism, but the debate continued because functionalists mounted actually pretty compelling responses to the Chinese room argument. It's by no means the case that the Chinese room argument ended the debate, and that's the case for pretty much all of these, right? Like, there are plenty of responses to Kripke's criticisms of the descriptivist theory. There are responses to the qua problem. There are responses to Quine, right? To the experience machine, etc. The situation is that for any view, for any argument, there's going to be unconceived objections to it. And then there will be unconceived objections to those objections. And it's not just, that it's not just like responses that people are pulling from thin air, as it were. I mean, these unconceived objections are very serious. Okay, yes, the Chinese room, well, there's plenty of debate about it, but it is a serious objection, right? It's something that, like, professional philosophers who'd spent their life thinking about this topic, they took that to be a very serious problem. It's something which maybe there's a convincing response, but it merits a response. And that's the case for all of these objections. So these are serious, unconceived objections. And then those objections themselves will, the unconceived objections, once they are conceived, it will turn out that they also faced serious, unconceived objections. So Mizrahi states the historical argument. Premise 1, the historical record reveals that past philosophers failed to conceive of serious objections to their favourite, then defensible theories. Premise 2, so probably present philosophers fail to conceive of serious objections to their favourite, presently defensible theories. So we should not believe our present philosophical theories. This is analogous to the argument from unconceived alternatives in philosophy of science. I have a couple of videos on that. It comes from Kyle Stanford, but applied to the history of philosophy. Okay, so the point is that we have basically this inductive challenge. The inductive challenge can be run on your beliefs. You can take it like as an individual and run it on your beliefs alone, or we can run it on the whole history of philosophy. Either way, the conclusion is that most of the positions I endorse probably face serious objections that I don't yet have an answer to. And this matters because we usually take it that a requirement of rational belief in a philosophical position is that you anticipate and respond to the relevant objections to the position. What these inductive arguments show is that philosophers appear to be very bad at anticipating important objections. Since philosophical theories are assessed primarily by, looking at arguments for and against those theories, the fact that so many of our arguments, that so many objections are unconceived, this undermines our ability to reliably judge philosophical theories. And these pessimistic inductions maybe also explain why philosophy seems to make no progress. At any given time, any philosophical position will face a host of unconceived objections that will be raised at a later time that will seriously threaten the epistemic credentials of that position. So, many later philosophers will come to reject the position. And, of course, these arguments against the position will themselves end up facing objections that were unconceived. So we end up on this merry-go-round, never forming a lasting consensus on anything, just going round and round and round. Okay, so that's the argument. That's the pessimistic argument. Let's consider some responses. Well, okay, so a first response is we might just try blocking the inductive inference by arguing that we cannot extrapolate from earlier times to later times. So we might say that there is some relevant difference between the earlier times and the later times that gives me good reason to think that the positions I currently hold do not face these unconceived objections. So, I might try blocking Francis's argument by arguing that, well, look, my philosophical knowledge, my reasoning abilities have improved over the years. It's no surprise that in the past, the positions I held faced unconceived objections. I was a worse philosopher back then. I'm much better now. I have more extensive knowledge of the philosophical literature. I've honed my critical thinking abilities, so I'm better able to anticipate potential problems. I mean, isn't this, this pattern of previously held views turning out to face unconceived objections? That's exactly what we would expect, even if I have currently arrived at the true beliefs, because I've learned philosophy over time. On the path to true beliefs, I can expect that there will be plenty of false beliefs. So there's no reason to think that the theories I accept today face serious, unconceived objections. Well, I mean, obviously there are some obvious problems with this kind of response. First of all, it's not clear that my philosophical abilities actually have improved in the relevant sense. I might have more knowledge than I did several years ago, but this doesn't entail that I'm better at constructing arguments or better at anticipating objections. In any case, while it's true that I continue to learn new things over time, I also forget plenty of things as well. I mean, I forget at least 90% of what I present in these videos, at least 90% of what I write in essays and so on. That's gone within a couple of weeks. I think it's plausible that, at a certain point, your philosophical abilities just plateau. I don't feel like I've improved as a philosopher much over the last, 5 years. Once you get to the point, I mean, I did a PhD, right? So once you get to the point that you're doing a PhD, there's not a great deal of improvement that's going to come. It's not, I mean, yeah, there might be minor improvements, right? But you're not going to be moving forward in leaps and bounds. The amount of improvement that occurred during the first 5 years of my philosophical training was much greater than the amount of improvement that occurred over the last 5 years. So anyway, that's one worry. Another worry here is, well, I mean, I could have given this exact same response in the past. 5 years ago, I could have given the argument that I was much better educated than I was 10 years previously. But of course, it turned out that many of the views I held 5 years ago were susceptible to objections that I had not at that time conceived. I mean, more generally, there just doesn't seem to be any decline in uncovering serious objections as this supposed improvement has taken place. Insofar as I have become a better philosopher, this seems to consist partly in the fact that I now recognise serious objections to views that I once held. If I have improved over time up to this point, I mean, the inductive argument would suggest that I should expect to continue improving in this way in the future. And so I should continue to expect to uncover, unconceived serious objections. If I think about the rate at which I uncover these serious objections over time, it doesn't seem to be slowing down, right? That's the point. Now, I mean, a similar point can be made concerning Mizrahi's argument, concerning philosophy as a whole. So we might say that modern philosophy is relevantly different in kind from earlier philosophy. Philosophers today have developed more sophisticated methods for analysing arguments. I mean, think of the use of formal logic and probability theory in philosophy. We've seen changes in the demographics of philosophy. Modern philosophy is more welcoming of other genders and races. It's become more open to people from lower socioeconomic classes. So, it's not like we're only getting kind of, the perspectives of just one very specific social class of person. So there are relevant differences. There are important differences between modern philosophy and, philosophy in the past. But the problem is that none of this seems to have made any difference with respect to our ability to uncover objections. So this pattern of positions facing unconceived objections, that just doesn't seem to have changed. Again, there hasn't been a decline in the amount of unconceived objections that we later uncover. Philosophers today are no closer to achieving consensus. They're no better at finding arguments that are resistant to objections. So if there is a way of blocking this induction, I mean, it's not entirely obvious what that way is. Okay. A second objection is that the inductive argument, the pessimistic argument, is self-defeating. So, the basic reasoning here is fairly obvious, right? Skepticism about philosophy is a philosophical position, and the pessimistic arguments that we have considered are philosophical arguments. So we should expect that they too will face serious objections currently unconceived. So we shouldn't trust those arguments. The pessimistic induction concludes that philosophical beliefs are untrustworthy, but the pessimistic induction itself is a philosophical argument. That's straightforwardly self-defeating. If the pessimistic argument is successful, we shouldn't trust it, which is just to say that it can't be successful, right? That's just to say we shouldn't trust it, right? Because, I mean, look, either the argument is successful or it isn't. If the argument is successful, then philosophy is untrustworthy, so we shouldn't trust the pessimistic argument. And if the argument isn't successful, then obviously we shouldn't trust it, because it goes wrong somewhere. But, either way, we shouldn't trust it. So it's self-defeating. I mean, I guess one move here might be, the philosophical skeptic might try to deny that the pessimistic induction is really a philosophical argument. So we'll return later to the question of what exactly counts as philosophy, but for now the relevant point is that the pessimistic induction appeals to what seem to be straightforward empirical facts. So we're just looking at the positions that people held at particular times and the reasons why they later changed their minds. That's all we have to do to make this argument. Okay, I just look at the sort of positions that I held in the past and the reasons why I changed my mind, or I look at the history of philosophy, the positions people held, the reasons why they changed their minds. So this seems to be, maybe it's kind of historical argument, or just it's a straightforward empirical argument. In general, we don't usually treat these sorts of simple inductive inferences as philosophical arguments. So let's say I observe all of the observed ravens that all observed ravens are black, right? I've gone out, I've observed ravens, I've seen that they're all black, and so I make this inductive inference that all ravens are black. Now, regardless of whether or not that kind of inference is justified, it doesn't seem to be a philosophical argument. It's a simple empirical inference, right? All observed ravens are black, so all ravens are black. So the thought might be that if this pessimistic induction, it's not a philosophical argument, it's a simple empirical inference. But of course, if the pessimistic induction isn't a philosophical argument, then it isn't self-defeating. It's not going to be undermined by skepticism of philosophy. Because the pessimistic induction only targets philosophical arguments, and it's not a philosophical argument. Well, I mean, this response I don't think is going to work. So we can grant, just for the sake of argument, that the inductive inference is successful. This is the empirical claim, right? Given my past experiences, my past experiences give me good reason to believe that the positions that I currently accept face serious objections currently unconceived. Okay, that's a straightforward empirical inference. Let's grant that. Well, now the question is, why does it follow that I must give up those positions, or that I'm not justified in believing those positions? The pessimistic argument seems to rely on this principle. So, principle J. If P faces serious objections to which you cannot give a satisfactory answer by your own lights, then you ought not to believe that P. But J is clearly a philosophical claim, and a fairly controversial one. So there are philosophers who will deny this. Consider, for instance, reliabilism. According to reliabilism, you are justified in believing that P, just in case P is the output of a reliable process. That is, a process that tends to produce true beliefs. Reliabilists about justification would not be troubled by the idea that a person holds a view that faces serious objections by their own lights. At least that's not necessarily a problem. On some reliabilist views, you need not even respond to the objections that you are aware of, let alone those that you are unaware of. Indeed, you need not have any reasons for your belief at all, in the sense of like reasons that you're consciously aware of. All that matters is that the belief is the output of a reliable process. So on this kind of view, on this kind of epistemology, we would not accept principle J. But okay, even if you're not a reliabilist, there are things we might say against principle J. So we might argue, well, look, responding only to the conceived objections, that's enough to make a belief rational. And, there's some motivation for this. After all, I cannot consider the unconceived objections. I can only think about the objections that have actually been conceived and that I actually come across. That's the best I can do. So the argument might go, well, that's what I should do. If you want me to change my methodology, show me a better one. And in this case, there cannot, in principle, be a better one. But it's just absurd to give up a methodology because it doesn't meet an ideal that cannot, in principle, ever be fulfilled. So it's reasonable for me to continue with this methodology of responding to conceived objections. Now look, you might say that these are not convincing responses to principle J. That's irrelevant, all right? My point is not that J is false. My point is that J is a controversial philosophical premise. So belief in J will be undermined by the skeptical argument. But, as we've seen, J or something very close to it is required in order to get this skeptical conclusion that you ought to suspend judgment about philosophical matters. So even if we say that the inductive claim is not philosophical, in order to get an argument for the conclusion that you ought to suspend judgment, in order to get an argument for philosophical skepticism, you're going to need some additional philosophical premise. And then the argument is going to be self-defeating. Francis does anticipate this self-defeat objection. He grants that we could simply deny that there's anything irrational in holding beliefs when you have good evidence that there are objections to those beliefs that you can't address. What he says is that, well, this is already bad news for rationality, because what it would show is that rationality is cheap and subpar. It would turn out that the standards for rationality are much less impressive than we thought and appear to be arbitrary and unprincipled. So Francis says, look, if rationality requires us to respond only to conceived objections, then rationality is unprincipled. It's unprincipled because the unconceived objections are just as much a threat to a theory as the conceived ones are. There's no relevant epistemic difference between objections that are conceived at the time a theory is formulated and then objections that are conceived only much later. The objections that are conceived only much later can be just as serious as the objections that are conceived at the time the theory is formulated. So, I think Francis would say, well, yeah, you've saved the rationality of philosophical beliefs only by making the standards of rationality arbitrary and unprincipled, and that makes rationality just much less interesting, I guess. More generally, Francis says, look, there are cases where the best available hypothesis isn't good enough. Okay, so this might be the case in origin of life research. There are many hypotheses about how life originally arose, about abiogenesis, but currently we don't have conclusive evidence in favour of any of them. So while it might be acceptable for a scientist to explore and defend a particular hypothesis, it looks like there's no good grounds for believing any particular hypothesis. Similarly, Francis says, there might be cases where the best available methodology just isn't good enough. the best that philosophers can do is respond to those objections that have actually been considered. So maybe it's reasonable for professional philosophers to defend their positions in this way, by proposing arguments and trying to anticipate objections. But the inductive argument suggests that this methodology is not good enough to justify belief in any particular philosophical position. Another response to the self-defeat objection is simply to grant that the argument is self-defeating. So there are many skeptical arguments that have been accused of self-defeat. I have a video on skepticism and self-defeat that I'll link in the comments. Perhaps, like other skeptical arguments, we can just embrace this. We can say, yeah, the argument is self-destructive, but this is a feature, not a bug. So you can put this argument forward as something that has merely causal influence. So the idea might be that if you reason through this argument, you will just find that your confidence in the philosophical positions that you endorse erodes. And this includes, of course, your confidence in this very argument. It's not that the argument provides justification for an anti-philosophical stance. There can't be this kind of justification. That's the whole point. So the argument isn't trying to provide justification for an anti-philosophical stance. There is no such justification. Rather, the argument will just tend to cause you to become more skeptical of philosophy. And the argument will also tend to cause you to become skeptical of itself. That's what it's supposed to do. It's destructive of philosophy in general, so of course it's destructive of itself. Maybe it's like Wittgenstein said, you climb the ladder, then throw away the ladder after you've climbed it. Okay. A third response to the skeptical argument is to deny that philosophers really hold beliefs, or at least to deny that it is the aim of philosophy to believe philosophical positions. So we can call the kind of view attacked by the pessimistic argument philosophical realism. According to the philosophical realist, the goal of philosophy is to form true beliefs, and you ought to believe that the best philosophical theories are true. So, think about these questions like, is morality objective? Is consciousness reducible to brain states? Are there ordinary objects? The philosophical realist holds that there are true answers to at least some of these questions and that the aim of philosophy is to discover these truths. By contrast, a philosophical anti-realist will argue either there are no true answers to most philosophical questions, or it's not the aim of philosophy to discover true answers to those questions. So as an example of the latter, Helen Beebe, in her article Philosophical Skepticism and the Aims of Philosophy, presents what she calls equilibrism. And her view is that the aim of philosophy is not to discover true beliefs, but to discover what equilibria there are that can withstand examination. So this involves finding a coherent system for one's philosophical commitments. Basically, in answering philosophical questions, I'm looking for a coherent system of opinion. I don't need to rule out all other theories. I don't need to respond to all possible objections. To accept a philosophical thesis is something weaker than belief. To accept a philosophical thesis is to put it forward not as something that is true, but as something that is a coherent system of opinion that has withstood examination. For Beebe, philosophy is more about, exploring ideas than generating true beliefs. So, does this allow us to escape the clutches of the skeptical argument? We might think that it does, because we might say, well, if philosophy doesn't aim to generate true beliefs anyway, then it's not an issue if we're not justified in believing philosophical conclusions. Because, we don't believe the philosophical conclusions. We just put these philosophical conclusions forward as coherent systems or something like that. We just say, look, this is a coherent system of opinion. I'm not saying that I believe it. I'm just saying it's a coherent system and I can defend it. That's all. Things might not be so simple, though. I think that the skeptical argument is going to be problematic if we're thinking of philosophy in terms of responding to arguments and objections. So let's take some philosophical theory T that I defend. I don't believe T, I just offer T as part of a coherent system of opinion that can withstand examination. But what does it mean for a position to withstand examination? Well, I mean, at the very least, it looks like its defenders had better have responses to the relevant objections. But the pessimistic induction gives me good reason to believe, for any philosophical position I defend, it will face objections that I've not yet even conceived. So, it looks like I'm not going to be justified in accepting the theory, even in BB's weaker sense of acceptance, where acceptance doesn't require belief. The general problem, I think, is that objections in philosophy do not merely target the truth of philosophical theories, they can target almost any feature of a theory that is presented as a reason for accepting or defending the theory. We might say that the aim of philosophy is to map out logical space, to find these equilibrium positions that are coherent systems of opinion. But of course, there can be objections to the internal coherence of a view. Positions that once seemed, at least internally consistent, turned out to face serious internal problems. Or you might argue from a kind of more pragmatist point of view. You might say that, you know, when we put forward these philosophical theories, right, the aim is to find theories that are useful in some way, that deliver some sort of pragmatic benefits. But one can object that actually theories which seemed to deliver certain pragmatic benefits do not do so. They don't have the benefits that their defenders claim they do. And so all of these can be among the currently unconceived objections. So it's not enough to say that, okay, we don't believe these philosophical theories. Whatever grounds we have for defending or for accepting the theories in some weaker sense can come under attack. And so it looks like the skeptical argument is going to be a threat. All right, we've seen some potential responses to the pessimistic argument. A final objection, maybe this isn't really an objection, maybe it's more of an observation, but, you know, final objection is that the argument is going to generalize. So the argument aims to target philosophy specifically, but the objection will be that this ends up generalizing to a more global skepticism of all beliefs, or almost all beliefs. So consider a generalized awareness condition. Generalized awareness condition is: S is aware that for almost every substantive thesis she defended at least several years ago, there were serious objections to the thesis that by her own lights she was unable to meet. Now, this doesn't specify anything about philosophy. This is about beliefs in general. Is this condition true? Well, Francis says no, it isn't. It doesn't seem to be true of scientists. Many of the claims that scientists defend are either already well established or they're just sort of uncontested accumulation of facts. Now, of course, scientific theories are sometimes shown to be false. This motivates the pessimistic induction argument against scientific realism. Again, I have a video on that. Moreover, scientists will sometimes report the results of new experiments which are later overturned. They sometimes engage in theoretical speculation that's later shown to have serious problems. Even so, the majority of scientific beliefs that are held by a scientist are not particularly speculative, and they have been stable, right? Like what the scientist learns from a textbook when they're being educated in the field, most of the sort of central claims in that book are going to be stable over decades. They're not going to face serious objections. Again, you know, I mean, science does change, but like the kind of central features of our, like, so like, you know, the basic claims of like general relativity or plate tectonics or something like that, right? Like, or the modern evolutionary synthesis. These have been pretty stable over the lifetime of a scientist. Similarly, if we consider common sense beliefs, you know, like the Earth orbits the Sun, or that most humans have two hands, these tend to be stable over a person's lifetime, and indeed over many generations. So the generalized awareness condition is not true. The awareness condition is true only of philosophy, and that's why the pessimistic argument targets philosophy specifically. Well, there are two potential worries we might have here. So first worry is, what exactly counts as philosophy? I mean, that is itself a philosophical question, a question within metaphilosophy. But theories in metaphilosophy are obviously threatened by the pessimistic argument. So the pessimistic argument entails that we won't be able to identify which of our beliefs count as philosophical, in which case we should suspend judgment about all our beliefs. Philosophical beliefs are defective, but for any given belief, I don't know whether it's a philosophical belief, so I shouldn't trust that belief. Now, I mean, in response to this, we might argue, well, look, all plausible metaphilosophical theories will classify certain traditions as philosophical and other traditions as non-philosophical. There are paradigmatic cases of philosophy and then paradigmatic cases of science, paradigmatic cases of art, and so on. Any metaphilosophy that, classifies philosophy needs to respect this. And I suppose that's fair enough, right? Like, the basic point would be, you don't need to be a philosopher to identify whether or not something is philosophy. Indeed, being a philosopher might hurt rather than help. Moreover, you don't need to be a philosopher to identify those research programs that are susceptible to these sorts of pessimistic induction arguments and those that are not. We can straightforwardly identify research traditions that tend to produce consensus, that tend to produce stable beliefs, regardless of what positions we take in metaphilosophy. But this raises a second problem. Let's grant that we can easily identify which research traditions count as philosophy. It may well be that these non-philosophical areas of inquiry are built on philosophical assumptions. Perhaps, for instance, the sciences assume an answer to external world skepticism, or perhaps science requires trusting particular institutions or particular experts in ways that can come under a philosophical challenge. See my video, Why Trust Experts. Regardless of what view we have of these matters, they are philosophical questions. And so it's susceptible to this pessimistic argument. So that is, even if the awareness condition does not hold of these other fields, we might worry that a successful pessimistic argument against philosophy is going to bring down any field that relies on substantive philosophical assumptions, and it turns out to be very hard to get away from such substantive philosophical assumptions. Philosophy and non-philosophy are entangled. Daniel Stoljar, in his article Realism and Equilibrism about Philosophy, considers a Morean argument against eliminative materialism. So consider the argument, I desire chocolate cake. If I desire chocolate cake, then eliminative materialism is false, so eliminative materialism is false. Now, suppose I believe the premises of this argument. Well, assuming the premises of this argument are true, well, it's surely acceptable for me to infer the conclusion. But the first premise, that I desire chocolate cake, that's a paradigmatic non-philosophical claim. That's an item of common sense. Indeed, it's not just an item of common sense. Also, a lot of psychology, a lot of history, and so on, will explain actions by appealing to intentional states like beliefs and desires. So arguably, all of these fields involve a commitment to a philosophical position, namely some sort of anti-eliminative materialism, right? All of these fields assume that folk psychological postulates like beliefs and desires are legitimate in some sense. Like, it's legitimate to appeal to those things when explaining and predicting action and behavior. So, I mean, really, the fundamental problem here is about, like, what is it, like, what are we justified in believing? Okay, that's the question. Now, we can grant that science as a practice does not involve philosophical assumptions. But the question is, what are we entitled to believe, right? Should I believe that science delivers true information about the world? You know, it's one thing to use the Big Bang model in deriving predictions, or to use it as a tool for developing new theories, or for building instruments, or whatever. It's quite another thing to believe that the Big Bang really occurred, that the Big Bang model provides a true description of the history of the universe. To believe that scientific theories provide true descriptions is to adopt a realist interpretation of science. And scientific realism is clearly a philosophical position. And so it's threatened by the pessimistic argument, right? If you believe that our best scientific theories are true, you are adopting scientific realism. And scientific realism is philosophy. You're doing philosophy at that point. And so it's threatened by the pessimistic argument. The same goes for common sense. Maybe we can perform actions in our everyday lives without making philosophical assumptions. I mean, non-human animals act without much reflection. Presumably they're not doing philosophy every time they search for food, right? Like every time a squirrel shoves nuts in its cheeks, it's not doing philosophy. But the question is what we're entitled to believe. It's one thing to act as if I have two hands. It's quite another to believe that I really do have two hands. Arguably, the belief that I really do have two hands will rest on philosophical assumptions. It's a controversial philosophical thesis that this belief does not involve philosophical assumptions. So, I have two hands. What does this assume? Well, it arguably assumes that perception is veridical. It assumes some sort of, it assumes that external world skepticism is not true. It seems to assume some sort of conception of the self, the I, right? I say I have two hands. What the hell's the I? So there's some sort of self involved there. It assumes a particular view of ordinary objects. It assumes that particles, like I assume that okay, so I take it that my hands are composed of cells, and then the cells are composed of molecules, and molecules are composed of particles, and so on. So when I say I have two hands, I'm claiming that there are two hands. I'm claiming that there are these things composed out of particles. That assumes a particular view of ordinary objects. All of these are philosophically contentious. So here is how we move from skepticism of philosophy to a more radical skepticism. I start with any everyday belief, the belief that I have two hands, say. But then I notice that it is philosophically contentious whether this belief involves philosophical assumptions. So given my skepticism of philosophy, I must suspend judgment about whether this belief involves philosophical assumptions. But I know, given my skepticism of philosophy, that if it does involve philosophical assumptions, then it isn't trustworthy. So the situation is, I don't know whether the belief I have two hands involves untrustworthy assumptions, which is, I don't know where, that's basically just to say, I don't know whether the belief I have two hands is trustworthy. If a belief rests on untrustworthy assumptions, it looks like I shouldn't trust it. So I don't know whether this belief I have two hands is trustworthy. So I should suspend judgment about it. And of course, this same kind of reasoning can be applied to almost all of our everyday beliefs. And so we end up with a much more radical kind of skepticism than the philosophical skeptic wanted to defend. Okay then. That is the end of that video. I hope you found that interesting. And man, I've been a little bit unwell recently. Okay, this is just a final point. Recording that was exhausting. This is how I care about you guys, see? I mean, I put myself through the ringer to produce content for you. Yeah, so anyway, I'm now going to wrap this up and go to bed. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye, everybody.